My 6-month-old baby was sleeping peacefully in his stroller. We had placed it on our front porch to enjoy the cool morning air. He loves feeling the gentle breeze and listening to the birds. It was a calm, quiet day. Then Karen from the HOA walked straight up our steps without asking. She yelled, "No strollers on the porch. It looks messy and breaks the rules." I stepped out and said softly, "He's just napping here. He's not bothering anyone." Karen got very angry. She stormed into our yard, grabbed a kettle of boiling water from her thermos and poured it right over my tiny baby. He woke up screaming in pain as red burns spread across his little body. His terrified eyes looked for me as he cried. Karen stood there with a proud smile and said, "Now the porch looks neat and proper again." She looked so happy with herself. She didn't know the man rushing out of the house in his hospital scrubs was my baby's father, a burn surgeon just home from the hospital. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you are watching from. And please hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. Sunlight spilled over the neighborhood, soft and golden, spilling across lawns and glinting off the leaves of the trees. A gentle breeze rustled through the branches, carrying with it the scent of fresh grass and the faint aroma of blooming flowers. Everything about the day felt slow and calm, as though the world had paused just long enough to let a family enjoy a moment of peace. On our front porch, nestled safely in the shade, the stroller sat quietly, rocking ever so slightly with the faint motion of the morning air. Inside it, my 6-month-old slept peacefully. His tiny hands rested gently over his chest, and the soft rise and fall of his small body kept perfect rhythm. Every so often his lips twitched, and I imagined he was dreaming of butterflies, of bird songs, of warm sun on soft skin. The serenity was almost tangible, a quiet bubble protecting him from everything else in the world. I sat in the rocking chair beside the porch railing, a cup of coffee warming my hands, watching him breathe. This was one of those rare moments in parenthood when time seemed suspended. No deadlines, no rushing, no pressures pressing in from the outside. Just the two of us in the morning light, connected in a way that needed no words. Beyond the porch, the neighborhood hummed softly. Birds chirped cheerfully, announcing their presence to the trees and fences around us. A car passed slowly down the street, its engine a distant hum rather than an intrusion. Everything was exactly as it should be. I let out a slow, contented breath, wishing that the calm could stretch on forever. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, and fast. Each step struck the porch stairs like a hammer against stone, echoing in the quiet morning. My stomach sank immediately. There was something in their pace, in the force behind them, that made my skin prickle. The stroller rocked a little more with the vibration of the steps, though my baby remained asleep, unaware of the disturbance. I froze in the chair, listening as the sound of approaching boots grew louder. My heart started to beat faster, a nervous rhythm that felt out of sync with the soft calm surrounding us. A shadow fell across the porch. I looked up just as the door at the top of the steps swung open, and she appeared. Karen from the HOA, whose presence always felt like a storm arriving without warning. She didn't smile, she didn't wave, she didn't ask or even hesitate at the threshold. Her eyes immediately scanned the porch, sharp and critical, as if she had arrived with a checklist instead. Common sense. The moment her gaze landed on the stroller, her expression hardened. "No strollers on the porch," she yelled, her voice cutting through the gentle morning sounds. "It looks messy and breaks the rules." The words felt like an intrusion in a place where only softness and quiet should exist. My baby stirred slightly in the stroller, his tiny eyelids fluttering but not fully opening. The sound of Karen's voice had pierced the morning air, but he was still in that half-dream state, unaware of the tension now gripping the porch. I stood slowly, placing my coffee carefully on the side table. My voice stayed calm, but my insides were churning. "He's just napping here," I said softly, stepping a few feet closer to the stroller. "He's not bothering anyone." Karen's face twisted in irritation. Her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't acknowledge my words. Instead, she took another step closer, her eyes scanning for any imperfection, any justification for anger. "Rules exist for a reason," she snapped, pointing toward the stroller as though accusing it personally of wrongdoing. "We can't just let this go. It sets a bad example." My stomach sank further. This wasn't about the stroller. It was about control, about someone asserting authority where it had no place. I swallowed the urge to argue, knowing that escalation would only make her more determined. I took another step forward, gently placing my hands near the stroller as if to shield it by my presence alone. The calm I had enjoyed all morning was gone. The birds' chirping seemed distant now, almost drowned out by the tension growing like a storm cloud over the porch. My baby's small hands twitched, and his eyes blinked open slowly, looking around with innocence that seemed impossibly fragile compared to the sharp anger towering above him. Karen stepped onto the porch, Ully now ignoring the invisible line of personal space. She had no right here. This was our home, our front porch, our morning moment, and yet she acted as if she owned it. I felt a surge of protectiveness rise in me, sharp and instant. My voice stayed calm, even as my heart raced. "He's safe," I said, my tone firm but gentle. "He's not hurting anyone. Please step back," Karen scoffed, her expression a mix of frustration and self-satisfaction. She gestured toward the stroller again, as if she could physically remove it with a wave of her hand. "This is exactly why rules exist," she said. "If we don't enforce them, people will just do whatever they want." I clenched my fists briefly at my sides. My baby's eyes were wide now, looking toward me, trusting and vulnerable. I realized in that moment that calm words were not enough. I needed presence, control, and a way to diffuse the situation before it escalated further. And then, from somewhere deep inside, I felt it. The certainty that someone else might arrive, someone who could intervene, before this confrontation crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. The calm of the morning had been shattered. The storm had arrived on our porch, and I had to protect the most important person in the world. We had placed the stroller on the porch on purpose. It wasn't an arbitrary decision. The morning air was gentle and cool, and the sun was warm but not too bright, just enough to filter through the lattice above and dance lightly on the porch floor. My baby loved moments like this, where the world felt vast and full of soft sounds but not overwhelming. The subtle rustle of leaves in the trees, the occasional bird call, even the distant hum of a car on the street. He seemed to notice all of it and yet remain perfectly calm. I sat just inside the door, leaning lightly against the frame, holding a cup of coffee that had cooled fast. Than I liked, my eyes never left him. Watching him sleep, I felt that mixture of awe and worry that comes with being a parent. Every tiny movement mattered, the twitch of a finger, the flutter of an eyelid, the way his chest rose and fell. These small rhythms were the soundtrack of my life at that moment, and I hung on them like they were fragile treasures. The porch had always been our little sanctuary. It wasn't extravagant, just a wooden deck with a couple of chairs, a small table, and potted plants my baby had taken a particular interest in over the weeks. Watching him reach for a leaf or gaze at the moving shadows had become a morning ritual. On days like this, when the world felt still and the air was quiet, it seemed like time itself slowed down for us. Nothing about the scene was messy or unsafe. The stroller sat neatly in its place. The baby's blanket, tucked carefully around him, kept him cozy without restricting movement. I had checked the straps, the hood, the padding. Everything was as it should be. It was, for all intents and purposes, a simple, ordinary morning. I took a sip of my coffee, savoring the warmth, and allowed myself a brief smile. There was a kind of calm in that simplicity, a small triumph in knowing that, for a few moments, everything was right. He was asleep. The air was gentle. There were no obligations, no interruptions, no looming deadlines. For a brief window, it was just us, a tiny family cocooned in the early sunlight. And then Karen arrived. She appeared almost suddenly, a shadow at the edge of the porch. Her presence was sharp and intrusive, like a gust of wind through a closed window. I had expected the calm of the morning to linger a little longer, but Karen's approach made it feel like the still air had been pierced. She carried herself with an air of authority, a self-assuredness that made it clear she believed she belonged here, even though she had no right. I noticed her eyes scanning the porch before they landed on the stroller, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't smile. She didn't greet me. She didn't even pause. In that instant, the sanctuary of the porch, the quiet space I had so carefully curated for my baby, felt invaded. I shifted slightly, instinctively placing myself a step closer to the stroller. My baby stirred a little in response to the sound of approaching footsteps, his small hands curling as though trying to grasp at something comforting. I swallowed the rising tension, keeping my voice low but steady. "He's just napping," I said softly, preparing to explain again. "He's not bothering anyone." Karen ignored me. Her gaze was critical, scanning every inch of the porch as though looking for a flaw. Her posture was rigid enough to make the air feel heavier, more tense. I noticed how her finger twitched as she gestured toward the stroller, her indignation clear without a single word. "Rules exist for a reason," she said sharply, her voice louder than necessary. This is exactly why neighborhoods fall into chaos. You can't just place things anywhere. I took another careful step forward, my eyes never leaving the baby. He's safe here, I said again. The porch is secure. Nothing about this is a hazard. Karen's eyes flicked to me for just a moment, a look of disbelief crossing her features. She tilted her head, her lips pressed tight. You think that matters more than the rules? She said, as though my words were proof of some kind of moral failing. The baby's tiny eyes fluttered open, half aware of the voices and movements around him. He let out a small coo, reaching instinctively toward the soft air, his innocence shining against the rising tension of the moment. I bent slightly, keeping my movements gentle, and whispered, "It's okay, little one. Mommy's Air. Everything's fine." The soft reassurance seemed to settle him slightly, but my own heartbeat had quickened. Karen's presence was growing more imposing by the second, her anger simmering in ways that made my chest tighten. I could feel it pressing down on the quiet morning air, threatening the calm we had worked so hard to cultivate. I kept my voice steady, though. I had to. My hands rested lightly on the sides of the stroller, a silent shield against the intrusion. "Please," I said more firmly now, "this is our home. You can't just step onto our porch and decide what's acceptable." For a moment, Karen seemed to hesitate, the force of her certainty faltering just slightly, but only slightly. She opened her mouth as if to argue further, her expression a mixture of outrage and self-righteousness. I braced myself, ready to defend the space, ready to ensure that my baby remained safe, calm, and undisturbed no matter what. The porch, once a haven of peace, had transformed. The soft sunlight, the gentle breeze, the quiet rhythm of morning, all of it was now overshadowed by the tension pressing in from the edge of the steps. The simplicity of the moment had been replaced with confrontation, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would protect this small bubble of safety, no matter what. And as Karen's eyes swept the porch again, landing on the stroller, I felt that first spark of determination grow. This was our morning, our space, our time, and I would not allow it to be taken from us. Karen didn't greet me. She didn't ask a question. She didn't pause to consider whether she belonged on our porch or whether it was appropriate to speak to a sleeping child or their parents in such a loud, aggressive tone. She pointed directly at the stroller, her finger rigid and accusing, and shouted, "No strollers on the porch. It looks messy and breaks the rules." Her word hit the air like a hammer. The gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, the soft chirping of birds, and even the faint hum of a distant car were swallowed by the sheer force of her indignation. For a moment it felt as though the world had tilted on its axis, and this single sharp voice was the only thing keeping it upright. I stepped outside immediately, lowering my voice instinctively, hoping to de-escalate without provoking her further. "He's just napping," I said, my tone calm but firm. "He's not bothering anyone. There's no danger here." Her face tightened with rage. The faint redness of frustration crept up her cheeks, and her eyes blazed with self-righteous fury. Karen had always believed in rules more than people, authority more than empathy. I had seen it before, yes, but never so close, never in my own yard, never so threateningly close to my child. "This is exactly what ruins neighborhoods," she snapped, stepping off the porch and into our yard as if crossing an invisible line could somehow give her power. Her boots clicked harshly against the stone path, a deliberate rhythm meant to announce dominance. The baby stirred slightly in the stroller, sensing the tension but remaining largely calm, wrapped in the security of the blanket and my presence beside him. I took a careful step closer, placing my hands lightly near the stroller, not on him, just near enough to remind him, and myself, that he was not alone. My mind raced. Karen was unpredictable. Every movement, every word seemed calculated to intimidate. She didn't just enforce rules, she weaponized them, using them to assert control over spaces and people who had done nothing wrong. "I understand rules exist," I said, maintaining a steady voice, "but this isn't about rules right now. This is about my child. You cannot decide what is safe or unsafe for him based on your opinion alone." Karen tilted her head, narrowing her eyes as though trying to find a flaw in my argument, a reason to dismiss it. "You think your personal feelings outweigh the community's regulations?" she asked, incredulous. "Do you have any idea what chaos would occur if everyone ignored the rules whenever they felt like it?" Her words were sharp, but they rang hollow in the context of the situation. The only chaos in this yard at this moment was the one she had created by storming in uninvited, yelling at a sleeping infant and turning a serene morning into a battlefield of fear and tension. The baby's tiny hand twitched as if sensing the rising unease. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing innocent eyes that had no idea what was happening, or why the air around him felt so heavy. I bent slightly toward him, whispering, "It's okay, little one. Mommy's right here. You're safe." My tone was soft, melodic, an anchor in the storm that Karen had brought with her. She ignored the whispered reassurance, her gaze locked on me now. Her posture stiffened, shoulders rigid, as if preparing for another attack. Not physical, but psychological, a show of dominance she seemed determined to enforce. "You people always think you're above the rules," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "But we all know what happens when neighborhoods let people do whatever they want. Standards disappear. Order collapses. Communities fall apart." I shook my head slowly, a deep breath rising through my chest. I needed to stay composed. I needed to be rational, because panic or rashness would only escalate the situation further. The baby was watching, small eyes wide, searching for comfort. My calmness could protect him more than any argument could. "Standards and rules are meaningless when they put a child at risk," I said firmly. "This is not about community standards. It's about basic human decency. You cannot enter someone's R&D uninvited and intimidate a baby or his parents." For a moment, I thought she might hesitate, reconsider the intensity of her approach. But her next movement told me she had no intention of stepping back. She shifted slightly, the hem of her jacket brushing against the porch railing, a subtle sign that she was preparing to escalate. My stomach tightened. I didn't know exactly what she intended to do, but her presence had already shattered the morning calm. The birds, sensing the tension, quieted. Even the leaves in the trees seemed to hang frozen in the air. The porch, once a place of safety and serenity, felt claustrophobic, like it had shrunk under the weight of Karen's rage. I kept one hand near the stroller as if proximity alone could form an invisible shield around my child. And then I heard it, a sound I hadn't expected yet had hoped for. The front door of the house swung open behind me. Fast, confident footsteps approached. My heart jumped, relief flooding through me before I even recognized it. The man entering the porch was instantly commanding, not with anger, but with presence. My husband. He had just come home from the hospital, still in his scrubs, and he immediately assessed the situation. His eyes took in the stroller, the baby, and Karen in a single sweep, narrowing on the source of the tension. "Step back," he said quietly, but with a weight that made Karen falter. There was no yelling, no threat, just the absolute certainty in his voice that this situation had crossed a line she could not ignore. Karen blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Her rigid posture wavered, her confidence faltering under the unspoken authority that filled the porch. She opened her mouth to argue, but the presence of someone who clearly understood boundaries, safety, and responsibility silenced her. I felt my baby stir again, sensing the shift in the air. My husband moved closer, positioning himself subtly between Karen and the stroller. His movements were calm, controlled, and protective. The tension in the yard was still palpable, but the immediate threat, the unpredictability of Karen, was now contained. "Now," my husband said, his tone firm but not aggressive, "you leave. You are on private property. You have no right to threaten a child or his family. Step off the porch and leave." Karen's mouth opened, closed, and then she finally took a step back. The rhythm of the morning air returned slowly, though it remained fragile. She muttered something about rules and standards as she retreated, her confidence shattered but her ego still intact. I exhaled slowly, relief washing over me. My husband knelt by the stroller, his presence reassuring the baby. I reached over, brushing a lock of hair from my child's forehead. "You're okay," I whispered. "You're safe." For the first time that morning, I felt the weight of fear begin to lift. The porch, though still tense, was once again a space where calm could return. Karen's insistence on rules over humanity had been halted, not by confrontation, but by the protective certainty of a parent, a guardian, and a professional who understood how to act decisively when it mattered most. And as we watched her retreat down the yard path, the lesson was clear. Authority without empathy is powerless against care, vigilance, and love. Karen's presence on the porch had already stretched the morning thin. The sunlight that once made everything glow now seemed harsh and sharp, casting long, accusing shadows across the wooden boards. Her eyes were fixed on the stroller, her lips tight, her expression unreadable yet menacing. I had hoped she would pause, reconsider, and retreat. I had hoped common sense might overtake her obsession with rules, but deep down I knew better. She reached into her bag and pulled out a metal thermos. I froze, my stomach twisted. The thermos itself wasn't threatening, it was an ordinary container, but the way she held it made it feel dangerous. Something about the rigid grip, the sudden focus in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders told me that this was no longer just about rules. It was about asserting dominance, proving her authority in a way that didn't care about consequences. Rules exist for a reason, she said coldly, twisting the lid with deliberate slowness. Her words were sharp and calculated, as if each syllable carried weight far beyond their literal meaning. The sound of the lid clicking against the metal seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet morning, punctuating the tension in a way that made the air itself feel heavier. I didn't think. I moved instinctively toward the stroller, fear and adrenaline flooding through me in equal measure. My hands extended toward the canopy as if shielding him with my body alone could protect him from whatever she intended. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice trembling slightly but loud enough to cut through the oppressive quiet. Karen didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She didn't seem to even hear me in the way a reasonable person might. She raised the thermos just a little higher, her gaze fixed on the stroller as though it were a symbol of chaos she needed to correct. Time slowed. The gentle breeze that had once brushed against the porch now felt like it had thickened into something tangible, something that carried tension in every swirl. The birds had stopped singing. Even the faint hum of the distant street disappeared, replaced entirely by the rapid thudding of my own heartbeat in my ears. Then, like a hurricane arriving on a perfectly still morning, the front door of the house burst open. The sound echoed across the porch and shattered the moment entirely. Heavy footsteps followed almost instantly. Deliberate and precise. My husband appeared, still in his hospital scrubs, his presence commanding and authoritative in a way that made the air itself seem to straighten. He had come straight from the hospital after a long shift, exhausted in body but fully alert in mind. And in that instant, everything changed. He assessed the situation in a single glance: the stroller, the baby, the rigid figure of Karen holding a thermos, my own tense posture frozen between fear and action. Without a word, his instincts took over. Every step he took toward the porch was deliberate, controlled, but it carried a weight that seemed to push the air aside. Karen froze, her confidence faltering for the first time. She hadn't expected anyone to intervene. She hadn't anticipated the presence of someone capable of reading the room in a heartbeat, of understanding the stakes instantly. Her self-satisfaction wavered, and a flicker of doubt crossed her face. "Step back," my husband said, his voice calm but unyielding. Not raised, not threatening, just absolute. The clarity and authority in that single sentence made the morning feel like it had shifted on its axis. Karen blinked, unsure, her carefully constructed arrogance beginning to crumble under the weight of his presence. The baby stirred in the stroller, sensing the change in the atmosphere. Tiny hands flexed, searching instinctively for comfort, and I felt my heart tighten further. I reached out, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead and whispering, "It's okay, little one. Daddy's here now. You're safe." Karen took another step forward, her mouth opening to speak, to argue, to assert her rules, but she stopped. The look in my husband's eyes, calm, piercing, unshakable, told her wordlessly that her attempt to dominate this space had failed. The certainty he radiated was not loud or violent. It was something far stronger, an immovable bow, undairy, a line she could not cross. Without breaking eye contact, he moved slightly, positioning himself between Karen and the stroller. Every movement was fluid, deliberate, controlled. He didn't shout, he didn't raise a hand, but the stance, the energy, the quiet power of presence was more than enough. Karen faltered. Her shoulders sagged just a fraction, her confidence slipping further with each heartbeat. She glanced at the thermos in her hand, then back at the small, sleeping figure in the stroller, and, finally, at me and my husband together. The combination of calm authority and protective presence had erased her imagined power. "You are on private property," my husband said, his voice steady, unwavering. "You have no right to threaten a child or intimidate his family. Step off the porch." Her lips pressed together, tight and thin. She opened her mouth to argue, to protest, but no words came. The certainty in his tone left no room for negotiation. The morning air, once thick with tension, began to shift. Karen's sense of control had completely evaporated. Slowly, reluctantly, she stepped back. One step, then another. The thermos, now useless in her grip, remained untouched by any action. She muttered something under her breath about rules and standards, but her voice was low, defeated, and meaningless. With one last glance at the stroller, at the baby, at the family she had almost terrorized, she retreated down the yard path. The porch, which had felt so small and suffocating moments ago, seemed to breathe again. The sunlight softened, the breeze returned, and the birds resumed their song. The fragile calm of the morning was not yet fully restored, but it was returning, anchored by the presence of someone who knew exactly what protection looked like. My husband knelt beside the stroller, gently brushing his hand across our baby's tiny form. I leaned closer, brushing the blanket, whispering reassurances that carried far more weight than any argument could. "It's okay," I murmured. "You're safe. Daddy's here. Mommy's here." He smiled briefly at me, tired but unshakable, and together we ensured the baby felt the return of safety and warmth. The porch once again was a sanctuary. The storm had passed, not through confrontation or aggression, but through calm, controlled presence and the unwavering certainty that our child would be protected no matter what. The lesson was clear. Authority without empathy is fragile. Rules without humanity are powerless, and even the most determined attempts at intimidation crumble in the face of careful, deliberate, loving protection. The morning sunlight returned fully, soft and warm, as if it too approved of the peace restored. Our baby, oblivious to the tension that had nearly swallowed the porch, yawned and snuggled into the blanket. For the first time in what felt like hours, I exhaled completely, letting the tension drain from my shoulders. We had survived the storm, and we had done it together. The front door had barely swung open when he appeared. My husband, still in hospital scrubs, moved with the kind of precision and calm that only someone trained to save lives could possess. Even after a long night at the hospital, when fatigue might have slowed any ordinary person, his eyes were sharp, scanning the scene instantly. He took in the stroller, the baby, the tense posture of Karen holding the thermos, and my own frozen stance in a single sweeping glance. There was no hesitation, no confusion, just recognition of danger and immediate action. "Don't," he commanded, his voice cutting through the charged air like a steel blade. Sharp, absolute, carrying a weight that left no room for negotiation. Karen froze, her hand half raised, the thermos still gripped tightly, her confident posture. Faltered for the first time. She had underestimated the force of presence that only someone who routinely faced life and death situations could radiate. He crossed the porch in 2 swift steps, moving with controlled urgency. His hands extended just enough to deflect the thermos away from the stroller. It clattered harmlessly to the ground, spilling nothing but the faint warmth of its contents onto the wood, far from the baby. Time seemed to slow around him, every movement precise, deliberate, yet fluid. It was almost as if the air itself bent around him, clearing the space, demanding compliance without raising a hand in aggression. Karen's face shifted through emotions faster than I could follow. Shock, confusion, anger, bewilderment. She had come believing in her authority, convinced that rules could justify her actions, yet now she felt the weight of immediate accountability. For the first time that morning, she looked small, utterly powerless against a presence that radiated authority, confidence, and unwavering protection. "You have any idea," my husband said quietly, stepping between her and our baby, his gaze steady and piercing, "what you almost did?" Her eyes widened. For once, the words of rules and regulations that had bolstered her ego seemed meaningless. She tried to speak, but the tension in her shoulders, the faltering certainty in her voice, made her stop. The sound of her breath, short and uneven, betrayed the realization that she had gone too far. The baby stirred slightly in the stroller, sensing the shift in the air. My husband bent slightly, his hands brushing the baby's tiny fingers, reassuring him with calm, gentle pressure. "You're safe," he whispered. "Nothing is going to happen to you. I've got you." Karen's voice finally broke the silence, though it was weaker than before. I was just enforcing the rules," she said, her words sounding small and fragile compared to the enormity of what had just occurred. "Rules don't allow you to threaten a child," my husband said evenly. "Not in my home, not in anyone's home." His tone was steady, unwavering, and there was no anger in it, only absolute certainty. It was the kind of authority that didn't need to escalate, that didn't require shouting or aggression. It simply existed, and that existence alone was enough. Karen's lips pressed together, and she took an involuntary step backward. Her confidence wavered completely. She glanced at the stroller, then at me, then back at my husband. The calculated arrogance she had brought onto the porch had evaporated, replaced by hesitation and fear. The baby yawned softly, oblivious to the human chaos around him, and I felt my shoulders relax slightly. I reached over, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "It's okay, little one," I whispered. "Mommy and Daddy are here. You're safe." Karen looked around as if searching for support from somewhere that didn't exist. She had come prepared to assert control, to justify her intrusion with a rulebook and indignation. But now there was only silence from the porch, broken by the calm voice of someone who had faced far greater challenges than her petty authority. "I think it's time for you to leave," my husband said, his gaze never leaving hers. You're trespassing, you've threatened a child, and you will not return to this property without permission." Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She tried to argue, tried to assert her authority, but the sheer clarity in his posture and voice robbed her of momentum. One step backward, then another. The thermos in her hand now seemed insignificant, an object without power in the face of presence and certainty. Finally, she turned and walked down the yard path, muttering about rules and standards, but the words were weak and meaningless. Her aura of superiority was gone. She was just a visitor leaving an unwelcomed porch, diminished by her own overreach. As soon as she left, the tension on the porch lifted slightly. The breeze returned, the distant hum of the neighborhood came back, and the birds resumed their morning chorus. The world felt ordinary again, but there was an understanding now that nothing would ever threaten this family when one of us was present. My husband knelt beside the stroller, brushing the baby's hand gently. "All good?" he asked softly, eyes scanning every detail to ensure no harm had come even from fear alone. I nodded, voice catching with relief. "Yes, he's okay. We're okay." The baby blinked at him, tiny eyes meeting his father's gaze, and I realized how small gestures of calm, protection, and presence could feel monumental to someone so tiny. For a moment, I marveled at the quiet courage it took to intervene, to act without hesitation, to know instinctively how to protect life without escalating danger further. Karen was gone, but the memory of her intrusion lingered, a reminder of how quickly calm could be shattered. Yet it also highlighted a lesson we would never forget. The authority of rules is meaningless when human life is at stake, and decisive, protective action always outweighs petty enforcement. My husband rose slowly, hands brushing the baby lightly as he adjusted the blanket. "Let's get him back inside," he said. "Morning air is lovely, Bee. We've had enough excitement for one day." As we carefully lifted the stroller together, the baby yawned again, stretching slightly in the warmth of our protection. I felt my chest loosen in a way it hadn't all morning. The porch, once a battlefield of tension, returned to its role as a sanctuary. The air smelled fresh again, carrying the faint scent of grass and flowers, and for the first time in hours we felt peace settle around us. Karen had tried to assert control with rules, intimidation, and audacity, but she had underestimated what mattered most: protection, presence, and love. These were forces far more powerful than any rulebook could ever be. And as the front door closed behind us, the sunlight streaming into the hall, I realized something essential. A family united in care and vigilance is untouchable, no matter how loud the storms outside may rage. The baby slept again, his tiny body calm in the gentle sway of the stroller, completely unaware of the tension that had surrounded him just minutes before. And that was as it should be. We were home, we were safe, and nothing, no petty rules, no arbitrary authority, could ever change that. The porch, which had been a battlefield of tension only hours earlier, finally seemed to exhale. The faint morning breeze returned, carrying the scent of freshly watered grass and flowers from the neighboring yards. The birds, which had gone silent during the confrontation, resumed their cheerful chorus, oblivious to the human drama that had unfolded just steps away from them. Yet, despite the return of natural calm, there was a lingering weight, a memory of the threat that had intruded on our home, our safe space. When the police arrived, it was not with sirens blaring or doors slamming. Instead, they moved with the quiet efficiency of trained professionals. 2 officers stepped up the porch steps, nodding to each other as Hay assessed the situation. Their eyes flicked from the stroller to the baby, then to the adults who had been present during the incident. Every movement was deliberate, careful, measured. They were here to restore order, not escalate it. I guided the baby into my husband's arms, watching as he cradled him with gentle precision. The infant rested his tiny head against his father's chest, breathing steadily, completely unaware of the chaos that had unfolded minutes before. My husband's presence seemed to radiate calm, a silent shield that extended to everyone around him. The baby's small fingers curled slightly, gripping his father's scrub fabric, finding comfort in the security that surrounded him. The officers began by speaking with my husband first. He recounted the events as succinctly and clearly as possible, explaining how Karen had trespassed, approached the baby with hostility, and attempted to assert arbitrary authority in a way that posed an immediate risk to a minor. His words were calm but firm, emphasizing both the potential danger and the legal violations. The clarity and professionalism in his tone left no room for misunderstanding. Next, I gave my statement. I described the morning's progression in detail, from the peaceful start to Karen's sudden appearance on our porch, her insistence on enforcing rules without regard for safety, and the escalation that had nearly put our baby at risk. I focused on facts, avoiding emotion in my description, though my hands trembled slightly as I recounted moments that had felt terrifyingly close. The officers listened attentively, jotting notes and asking clarifying questions. Their professionalism was reassuring, a stark contrast to the tension that Karen had brought. It became clear that her self-assigned authority as an HOA representative carried no legal weight in this context. Trespassing laws, endangerment statute, tests, and common sense safety regulations superseded any arbitrary rules she might have tried to enforce. Karen herself was outside, now restrained and calm, only in the sense that she had no more room to argue. The officers instructed her to stand aside as statements were taken. She muttered something about rules and standards, but her words sounded hollow against the weight of law, ethics, and the protective presence of my husband. She had been exposed for what she truly was, someone who had tried to impose control without understanding consequences, someone who had underestimated the seriousness of her actions. Once statements were complete, the officers explained what would happen next. Karen would face consequences for trespassing, for creating a situation that endangered a minor, and for intimidation. Legal measures would ensure she could not attempt to repeat such behavior in the future. The language they used was formal, precise, and utterly unambiguous. Authority had been restored, not through confrontation but through law and accountability. I watched the baby, now stirring slightly in my husband's arms. He yawned, stretched his tiny hands, and cooed softly, oblivious to the human drama and adult errors that had surrounded him. The innocence of his tiny gestures was a reminder of what mattered most: life, safety, and care. He didn't know about HOA regulations or disputes or rules misapplied. He only knew the warmth and protection of his parents. As the officers concluded their work, one of them knelt down, offering a gentle smile to the baby. "You're safe now, little guy," the officer said softly, as if speaking directly to him. My husband responded with a quiet nod of gratitude, the baby's tiny fingers curling even tighter around his scrub fabric, seeking reassurance in the calm energy of his father. Karen was escorted away, her protests muted by the firm, procedural actions of law enforcement. She insisted one last time that she had only been enforcing rules, but there was no anger in her voice, only the realization that authority meant nothing when used to threaten, intimidate, or endanger others. Her previous confidence, her self-righteousness, had been replaced by a quiet and uneasy acknowledgement that her actions had consequences she could not control. Once she was gone, the porch seemed to breathe again. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting soft, warm patterns across the wooden boards. The gentle sway of the potted plants reflected the returning calm. The birds sang freely, and the air felt lighter, infused with relief. I lowered myself onto the porch steps, taking a deep breath as I looked at my baby, nestled safely against his father. My hands rested lightly on his tiny head, brushing back soft wisps of hair. "It's over," I whispered. "You're safe. Everything is okay now." My husband shifted slightly, ensuring the baby's comfort, and looked at me with quiet reassurance. "It's over," he echoed. "No one can harm him while we're here. We're always vigilant, always protective. That's what matters." The afternoon continued, slow and peaceful. Neighbors passed on the street, unaware of the drama that had unfolded earlier. The world moved as it always did, and yet, for us, there was a renewed sense of security, of control over our space, of the recognition that human life and safety were far more important than arbitrary authority or rigid rules. Later, when the house was fully quiet and the baby slept soundly in his cry, indoors, my husband and I reflected on the morning. The intrusion had been frightening, reckless, and dangerous, but it had also clarified priorities. Rules, procedures, and regulations existed to maintain order, yes, but they could never outrank compassion, protection, and human life. The lesson, though learned the hard way by someone else, had been reinforced profoundly for us. Vigilance and care were paramount. Karen would leave the neighborhood with a memory she would never forget. A child's safety was never negotiable, and authority without empathy was meaningless. And for us, the morning's events had created a new, unshakable certainty. Our family was a unit, protected by love, vigilance, and presence. No arbitrary rule could ever change that. The porch remained peaceful, the sunlight soft and warm, the breeze gentle, and for the first time since the incident began, everything felt truly restored. The baby slept peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling with perfect rhythm, completely unaware of the danger that had almost touched him. And that was exactly how it should be. Safety had been restored, order had reestablished, and lessons had been learned, not through chaos, but through calm, decisive action and the unwavering certainty of protection. Rules never outrank human life, and for us that truth had been reaffirmed, forever engraved in the morning light of a porch that had seen the worst and survived.